Well, hello, welcome. I'm glad that you're here with us today as we continue our chronological read through of the Bible. Well, we've seen over the last few readings how Saul, the first king of Israel, has always had difficulty from the outset obeying God's instructions. Because he didn't attack a Philistine outpost as God had told him to do before becoming king, his kingship was questioned. Because he didn't obey God and wait at Gilgal for Samuel to make the sacrifice before going into battle. Saul actually went and started the sacrifices himself, while the kingship would not remain in Saul's family. Today, Saul's disobedience in a campaign against the Amalekites will result in Saul being rejected as king by God. Indeed, he'll remain king of Israel for some time after that. But God will choose another, someone after his own heart, who will obey him. And the Spirit of God will depart from Saul and be replaced by an evil spirit, even as God's Spirit will be with David, God's choice. Samuel delivers to Saul God's instructions that Israel attack the Amalekites and totally destroy them and everything they have, men, women, children, animals, everything. And the reason is that they had opposed Israel when Israel was coming out of Egypt. So what's going to happen to the Amalekites is the same thing that was to happen to the peoples of the Promised Land when the children of Israel went in. Well, Saul warned the Kenites who lived among the Amalekites to leave the area lest they fall victim to what was about to happen, because the Kenites had showed kindness to Israel when they were coming out of Egypt. So clearly Saul understood God's command and the reason behind it. Even so, Saul didn't carry it out completely, because he spared the Ammonite king Agag and the best of the animals. In simple terms, once again, Saul was disobedient to God. When confronted by Samuel, Saul tried to excuse his behavior by saying that, the best had been set aside for offering to the Lord. But Samuel admonishes Saul and tells him that obedience is better than offering. Saul even refers to Yahweh as your God when he talks to Samuel, and he tries to shift the blame to his troops. Saul wants Samuel to go with him, but Samuel refuses to go with Saul because Saul still won't admit his sin. He's trying to weasel his way out of it. When Samuel tries to leave Saul, Saul grabs at his robe and he tears it. And Samuel tells Saul that just as that robe is torn, so also God has torn the kingdom from his hands. Finally, Saul admits his sin, and Samuel then, with Saul having admitted his sin, Samuel then goes with him to Gilgal to worship. Samuel kills King Agag, as Saul and the troops should have long before. And then Samuel departs from Saul, never to advise or admonish him again, because God has rejected Saul as king. We're told that God regretted having made Saul king, but Samuel mourned Saul as though he were dead, or maybe somehow he had hoped that Saul might yet somehow be restored. God tells Samuel to stop mourning Saul and to anoint a new king whom God will point out to him. God sends Saul to Jesse's house in Bethlehem. And even though Jesse did not think to even present his youngest son David, God points David out as the one who is to be king. So Samuel anoints David, and David receives God's Spirit. At this point, this is a private ceremony. It would appear that David's brothers are cognizant of it, and we presume that Jesse's cognizant, although that isn't explicit. As mentioned earlier, when God's Spirit left Saul, an evil spirit comes in his place. Remember that consistent, deliberate sin against God can result in God turning one over to their sin. You might even remember the Pharaoh constantly hardening his heart until finally God endorses, shall we say, that hardening of his heart. Saul's servants recognized that Saul needed to be soothed when that evil spirit would come on him, and that music would do the trick. So they sought a court musician, someone who would play music for Saul when the evil spirit came on him. One of these servants knew that David was a skilled musician, so David was brought to Saul, and whenever David would play for him, the evil spirit would depart from Saul, at least for a time. It's interesting when you remember that David is already filled with the Spirit of God, and then that evil spirit would depart from Saul when David was playing in his presence. Notice that Jesse sends David with gifts of bread and wine and a goat. Now, you may not remember this, you probably don't remember this, but those are the same gifts that Saul received when he was anointed king. David came before Saul. David loved Saul. Remember how incredulous David was later on when Saul tries to kill him, and how David would never lift a hand against Saul? David loved Saul, and he became Saul's armor bearer. At this point, likely one of many such servants who were close like that. We are told that Joab had 10 armor bearers, so it wouldn't be out of the question that Saul would have quite a number of them as well. Close, trusted servants. Finally, we have the account of the confrontation between David and Goliath. Apparently, David is traveling back and forth to tend his father's sheep, even as he is a servant and a musician for Saul. It may seem odd that Saul doesn't seem to remember David, but Saul has a number of servants, and David hasn't yet become as distinguished among them. Of course, that's about to change, isn't it, with a bang? Well, David hears the giant Goliath insulting Yahweh on one of his trips to bring supplies for his brothers who were in the army fighting at the time. David can't believe this. He begins to inquire about what's going on here and what's going to be done for the one who defeats Goliath. His brothers hear about this, and they sternly rebuke him for dabbling in their business and tell him, just go back home. David is told, though, that the person's family will be exempted from taxes. The person that kills Goliath, that their family will be exempted from taxes, and that their person will receive Saul's daughter in marriage. Saul hears that someone's out there asking questions, so he has this person brought to him. Doesn't really seem that Saul recognizes David as one of his servants, and he certainly doesn't, even if he does recognize him as one of his servants, he certainly doesn't recognize David as a warrior. But David explains to him his exploits against the wild animals while tending his father's sheep, and he expresses confidence that God will prevail against Goliath. Notice that Saul, a head taller than anyone else, cowers before Goliath, but David, small and young though he may be, is confident of the victory that the Lord will give. David, of course, defeats Goliath with his sling. There's a number of details you can read as you're going through, but he strikes Goliath in the forehead with a stone, and then he cuts off Goliath's head. The troops of Israel rush out and defeat the Philistines that day, and suddenly Saul is quite interested in just whose son this David is. After all, he's promised his daughter in marriage to him, and so David comes before Saul. And because Abner, his servant, doesn't really know who this David guy is. And as David stands before Saul, holding Goliath's head, Saul might remember that this young man has done what he saw had failed to do in his responsibility as king, which was to defeat the Lord's enemies. Is it possible that Saul at this point has his first inkling that maybe this is the one that God has chosen to replace him? Remember, Saul knows that he is going to be replaced as king. Well, whatever Saul's thoughts were, David, though he has already been anointed king of Israel, he is polite, he's respectful, and he's submissive to King Saul, as he will be all of Saul's life, never seizing the kingship from God's anointed, but waiting on God's timing. That ends our reading for today. My prayer is that you continue to learn and to grow through these readings, and I look forward to joining with you as we gather again tomorrow.